So the next event that we have today. Oh, I thought you were, okay, never mind. False start. So the next event that we have. So the next event we have today is a graduate lecture by third year Justin Maxon, where he will share the work that he's developed over his time within the program. And so without further ado, I will let Justin take it away.
Thanks so much, Bex, for the introduction. Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Justin, and this is my graduate lecture. I have been the woke whitey, the mighty whitey, the cool white boy, the broken white, a far cry from privilege. My childhood was a perfect cocktail for these white racial tropes. A proximity to poverty and oppression, growing up poor on the Hoopa Valley Reservation, a connection to a white savior hero, General Meade, who defeated Ulysses S. Grant in Gettysburg, the unsolved murder of a best friend who happened to be African-American, an immigrant Italian grandfather who could never see his own privilege, and the psychological control over my body by others. All these experiences coalesced into a single message. I wasn't as privileged as other white people, and therefore I wasn't as white as other white people. And those first few lines from my talk were taken from my personal statement when applying to the Art and Social Practice MFA program at PSU. And over the last 3 years, this program has helped me reconcile my power and privilege as an artist and photographer who is racialized as white. My practice now works to remedy the harm that I caused during my time as a photojournalist, where I was in control of narratives that were not mine to possess. The question driving my practice at this moment is, how do you work to counter what Bell Hooks describes as the seduction of images that threatens to dehumanize? And through mentorship, I've come to answer this question by returning home to the places, the people, and the issues that have informed who, what, where, and how I've chosen to represent with my camera. So here is a quick overview of my talk. I will start by examining some early life influences which serve as the backdrop for my early career as a photojournalist. I will share the project Chester, Staring Down the White Gaze, which spans my 8 years working in Chester, Pennsylvania as a photojournalist and contextualizes the work that I'm doing now to remedy the harm that I caused. I will then end by delving into my grad project, Field Guide to a Crisis, which activates the crisis resilience skills individuals have developed in their recovery from substance abuse during the COVID-19 pandemic. I will share how both projects challenge different forms of knowledge authority that I've been complicit within, including mass media and higher education. I will also delve into my relationship to mentorship as a central figure in my personal life and a conceptual undercurrent within my work. And also throughout, I'm going to share a few short stories that reflect key moments in my personal history that have undoubtedly shaped my practice. It's easy to see that I sought the path of a photographer, craving order, begging for purpose, and seeking control. And this first story is called Growing Up on the Hoopa Valley Reservation. I walked down a busy mountain road, up a gravel-rutted drive. There is a house with 10 children of all ages, some crawling, walking, running. I fit in with the torn cushions, the dark carpets long since vacuumed, the dirty candy wrappers. My best friend Carlisle and I would spend our days and nights watching all the movies that adult supervision would forbid. The afterwards half-running nighttime walk home without streetlights, and a half shadow would send my heart pounding. If I were both lucky and unlucky, my father would still be sleeping when I got home. Having spent the day in bed, his own chainsaw sounds at work, carving his room to pieces. The Freddy Krueger of my father's snores would scratch at my door. The don't leave me, I'm dying buzz of the oxygen machine, a sagging mattress, flesh, and slumber. There was smell in every room, shower neglect, child neglect. Surrounded by garbage bags of wasted years, my father wore his poverty proud. It was proof of his disadvantage. And my experience growing up in Hoopa taught me many things. But the one thing that translates to me picking up a camera was that I unconsciously held the belief that I belonged in spaces and with people that were not from my own positionality. And I think the true power of photography isn't the message it reveals, but the freedom of motion and the ownership of spaces that are not directly connected to the maker. The impetus to be anywhere you want to be, to see anything you wish to see, to interpret and translate without restraint. And I learned there is a chemical response waiting at the end of discovery that fills a space of belonging. And a question that I've asked myself many times is, have white people, such as myself, failed in our capacity to measure up, that we spend our life work chasing that feeling at the expense of others? So it's no wonder whiteness and the camera. I was trained as a photojournalist, and during college around 2008, the newspaper industry was essentially dead. And students were being educated in an obsolete field. So distinction was required to even have the hope of making a living. And the parachute journalist was the ethos of that time, where students would travel the world, spending short periods of time, extracting culture from context in order to reproduce the visual language that won awards. And I committed this act of violence. While I was also in school, I did a number of internships for the Associated Press and the New York Times. And while I was working in Philadelphia for the AP, I started my relationship with Chester, a predominantly African-American community just south of Philly. And this next story is called White Oblivion. In the summer of 2008, a suspicious fire burned down a home with a father, mother, and daughter trapped inside. In a rescue attempt, Fast Eddie dies a hero. I was a 24-year-old fresh photography intern looking to please. And that morning, I was told to arrive early and wait for the moment when someone would come and make news. Eventually, a distraught relative stood grieving in front of the home. And I stood there with my long lens, and I shot away. I shot away into the night that was my white oblivion. And my photograph was in print the next morning, front page above the fold. It was an unspoken truth at that time that Chester is no place for silent grief. It must be broadcast and in newsprint. I thought by covering news, no matter the topic, was always good news. So like I mentioned, I spent around 8 years from 2008 till 2015, documenting the lives of people in Chester. And it took me many years to recognize that I was part of the problem. I'd begun to see that I'd assumed a role in my relationship with Chester, that of a photojournalist propagating the white gaze's predefined narratives of the urban Black experience. And after this awareness, I canceled myself out. And without anyone's help, I shrunk away into anonymity. I stopped taking pictures for 3 years because, like I mentioned, I couldn't reconcile my relationship to power and privilege as a white maker. The feeling of extraction was omnipresent. I was taken everywhere I went. And I realized that I could not move forward as an artist with integrity without first resolving my past and contending with the many identities that I was born into. So after being frozen in place from white guilt, I began working on a collaborative book project with my mentor, Dr. Harukati Sharif Williams, who is a scholar, artist, sex educator, and cultural critic. And the title is Chester Staring Down the White Gaze. And the project uses the work I completed as a photographer covering Chester, along with photographs from my childhood archive and archival media coverage of the city, to critically interrogate how whiteness, white supremacy, and white nationalism operate in American visual culture. And as a counter narrative to the white gaze, the book also centers the voices of local artists and community members, all of whom I was in close relationship to during my time there. I first began my relationship with Dr. Harukati in 2017 by hiring him to evaluate an early version of the book manuscript. And in his editorial feedback response, he said something to me that I'd been processing but never openly admitted. For years, every time I would return to my hometown of Eureka, California from Chester, I would pass this stretch of the California 101 North Highway called Richardson's Grove. It's where the road weaves and stretches you around old growth redwoods as wide as a car and as tall as a skyscraper. And the smell of the forest would dislodge this locked memory from my childhood. That of a young boy who was my ever-present bully and obstacle to emotional safety growing up. And in my mind, swirling in some imaginary scene where I would be humiliated in public, I would fight him. And as I got older, each trip I took home and each invented reenactment, the closer I got to beating him. But the closer I got to winning and the more my love for Chester grew, the less comfortable I felt returning to my work. And Dr. Harukati writes, I read a deep and profound homoerotic tension with Black masculinity, possibly tied to your future with the boy, to your history with the boy who bullied you, and the ways in which you internalized an emasculation through that relationship. Your process appears to work towards taking power over him by representing him via text and images, possibly without his consent. And this feedback really struck a chord with me. It made me realize just how personal this work needs to be. As a white person engaging in equity work, the personal must be central in any challenge of the white gaze, because what whiteness does is it protects itself by only admitting certain truths. So without reflection, admission, and reckoning, there is only anonymity and complacency. Therefore, social responsibility within capitalism, diversity statements, and social media posts claiming wokeness and solidarity only serve as virtue signals for white supremacy to operate in plain sight. So with our project, Dr. Haruguchi and I built a visual glossary of white racial tropes to unpack my relationship to whiteness. And we use this framework to reconsider my work in Chester, along with other contemporary and local media coverage, contemporary and historical local media coverage of the city, to elucidate the ways in which whiteness reflects its own values when reflected off the bodies of Black people. This trope is called the Great American Hero, and for each piece, Dr. Haruguchi writes a short essay, and here is an excerpt from his writing. Myths are important to a society or culture. They help its members find meaning, purpose, and even personal identity. The Great American Hero is a myth that places Euro-American men and men racialized as white at the center of hero narratives. They are the ones who slay the dragons, overcome enormous obstacles, save the cities from supervillains, and then end up with the girl in the end. This next trope is called the Great American Family. The Great American Family is one such myth: a father, mother, 2.6 children, and a dog. The Great American Family invisibilizes realities. It makes invisible the rates of drug abuse, childhood sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse, poverty, and underemployment within families in the United States. It makes invisible the fact that there are Black, Indigenous, and other families of color in the US that are structured differently because of culture and the impact of settler colonialism, imperialism, white supremacy, and capitalism. And like I mentioned, the book is full of co-authors from the city who tell their own narratives. And their work in representing their community provides a vibrant, intimate, and familiar aesthetic. Additionally, throughout the pages of the book, the co-authors are in conversation through handwritten text that analyzes, critiques, and interprets the nature of the white gaze that is placed on their community. Desire Grover, who is a graphic design artist, makes a series of contemporary Chester postcards as a counterpoint to the historic versions that are dominated by the white perspective. Wadeem Ringgold, a citizen journalist, started his own Facebook news site called Bird's Eye View. And for more than a decade, he would live in proximity to a police scanner, following first responders as they arrived at various events in Chester. And he would post live from these events to his audience of followers. And Chester citizens would look to him for news. Leon Patterson, a self-taught photographer, documented his life as a member of the Bacon family from since 2009, which marks the same period of time that I also photographed them. His archive of images is in the thousands, featuring moments of his relationship to the family, birthdays, Christmas mornings, the birth of his children, and the daily moments of connection between his wife and his children are all exquisitely captured. In addition to the book, we've also been developing some supplemental material to engage audiences and how to use the work as a pedagogical tool, which includes a workshop designed for white media makers to question representation of the self and others along with an educational website for photographers interested in becoming more conscious of how the white gaze has informed their work. And through my mentorship with Dr. Huakati, one of the most important lessons that I learned is that the community that I hold membership in will automatically hold me more accountable when it comes to the nuances of representation. So in 2015, I returned to my hometown of Eureka. Some quick context into Eureka. It's an old logging town of about 30,000 people located on unceded Wiyot territory on the north coast of California. And the California report labeled Eureka as one of the most dangerous and drug-addicted communities in the state. The county lacks accessible addiction treatment services, and the waiting list for a bed within the treatment programs in the region often exceeds the need for services. And my story of substance abuse lies here, as does my recovery. I remember precisely that first feeling of withdrawal. It was my senior year of high school, and the urge led to its conclusion. I phoned my dealer. I found a bathroom stall at school, and the heroin. That wild beauty, it fills the deficiencies with a perverted grace. My fortunate path led me to a committed mentor who eventually became my adopted father. His name was Rosendo Medina, an Apache elder who was a caseworker for people in transition. And he saw strengths in me that I was unable to recognize in myself at the time, which helped me reconsider the value that I held within my community. And one of the ways we communicated was through letters. And here is a passage he wrote to me in 2003 called Dear Son. Justin, son, sit and open your mind to your own inner wisdom. You're making progress. A warrior's life is not about imagined perfection or victory. It's about love. Love is a warrior's sword. Wherever it cuts, it gives life, not death. Love can only be felt. And he passed away tragically in 2019. And since then, I've been left with an emptiness that I've only been able to fill by continuing his legacy. But even with Rosendo's love and support, the stigma from my past is still unreconciled. And during our relationship together, Rosendo's wife actively worked to isolate our relationship because she saw me as just a drug addict. And in fact, his obituary doesn't mention me by name, and I'm only referenced in this short passage. He worked helping the homeless, drug and alcohol addicted turn their lives around. According to the WHO, addiction to illicit drugs is the most stigmatizing condition. And the media plays a significant role in shaping stigmatizing attitudes towards substance abuse through misrepresentation. However, while the opioid crisis has disproportionately affected white Americans, media coverage of white suburban drug use is notoriously sympathetic, with headlines like this: "It happened to a bright kid like Ian." However, real drug users are a picture-perfect opportunity to uphold the good-bad binary within the hierarchy of whiteness, which in turn helps maintain white supremacy, because white people have been codified as white people who don't act like white people. They are white people who break the expectations of productivity and citizenry. and who threaten white social position. Therefore, the visual representations depicting the opioid epidemic have often showcased the depravity of rural white Americans. And it doesn't take a close examination of Time Magazine's opioid diaries to see this hyperbole at play. The issue, which was released in 2019 and dedicated to the pandemic, had a total of 32 images. And out of those images, 10 showcased drug use, needle in the arm, 7 were death or overdose, and 7 were arrest. And what the media does by choosing to focus on actual drug use is it highlights individual accountability when depicting addiction, rather than looking at the systems that create the conditions for abuse. And this brings me to my grad project, Field Guide to a Crisis, which I co-conceptualized with my partner, artist Marina Lopez, that began in 2020 at the beginning of COVID. And it's been funded by the National Geographic Society, California Arts Council, Center for Photographic Art, and the Humboldt Area Foundation. And the project functions as a teacher's training tool, mentoring people residing in sober living homes in Eureka to become educators in resiliency, where I led regular workshops helping participants identify their own unique crisis resilience skills and teach them how to use and teach others how to use them through lesson plans, instructional videos, and public presentations. And in turn, participants collaborate to create a field guide publication, which serves as a new form of knowledge authority. And this project came out of a moment when we were all in crisis because of the pandemic and collectively were looking for answers. So in my mind, it just made sense to turn to people who are experts at navigating crisis, but are typically disavowed from society. And the project was also created to meet the needs of the recovery community at a critical junction during the pandemic, when overdose rates have been higher than they've ever been in the United States. And typically, once low-income individuals go through a treatment center, their only option is moving into a sober living home where they often no longer have access to professional services. And before COVID, NA was one of the only long-term support systems for people fresh in their recovery. And with the cancellation of in-person support, many people did not have access to technology to continue to show up for the meetings. One of the main organizers and participants in the project, Aaron Ochoa, said that he went from 4 to 5 in-person meetings a week before COVID to 1 online meeting in just 2 months. So those that couldn't make the transition online were left feeling isolated and anxious for their recovery. So what I hope his work does is that it fills a missing link within the continuum of care for traditional addiction recovery services. And here are a few of the questions that we use as the framework for this project. What and who is worthy of knowing? How does knowledge and value interact? Are there new forms of knowledge that can build new values? What are the conditions that create value? What ways can those conditions be claimed by people who aren't normally valued? Now, so let's get into the project itself. Here is a quick table of content to understand the steps that we took that all build on each other. The project begins with the skills, where each participant is led through a series of exercises to identify their own accumulated skills. Then they select the one skill they want included in the guide and create a photographic reenactment to illustrate it. Essentially, they pick the scenario and then tell me when to take the photograph. And in this context, photography represents a useful tool for participants to translate their skill in real time because it's accessible. So it's easy for them to imagine themselves in a photograph. Then the illustration becomes the next tool to translate the pose into an aesthetic that mimics the visual authority of a field guide. And the drawings were completed by me and a few by Matthew Contos. And rather than having the photograph be the end goal, photography for me now is just one medium that I can rely on to help people with self-representation, which serves as a direct contrast to how I previously used the medium in my early career, when I was telling stories about people instead of with them. So once their movements have been translated into an illustration, they then write a simple set of instructions for how others can learn it, followed by a short statement about why it matters. So here is Tim Dranovich's skill of being alone. He writes about how he spent a lot of time being grounded while growing up. And for months and months on end, he couldn't leave his room because his stepmother just didn't want to deal with him. And that's when he had to put a positive spin on everything and trust in his own company. And he writes, being alone is thankfulness, and it comes from not having. The steps to his skill are: 1, there are no 10 steps to it. 2, remember good things you've learned from family and friends. 3, get rid of any negative people in your life. 4, rely on yourself. 5, enjoy repetition. 6, simplify your life. 7, seem like you have more going on than you do. 8, be happy with yourself. 9, don't cause trouble with other people. The project continues when participants are asked to write short stories about the birthing moment of their skill. So the next story, which was written by Aaron Ochoa, is called The Sandwich. And his skill is taking care of shit before it builds up. Every night, I would notice a stack of sandwiches that looked so much better than the sandwiches that I would eat at lunch. There was lettuce and cheese and tomatoes, and my sandwich was just plain. The sandwiches looked as if they were made from a deli, a homemade, with all the fixings. They probably tasted fresh and crisp. When I inquired about them, I was told they were the workers' sandwiches. As the days went on, my longing for one of those sandwiches grew and grew. I was told the only job that I could get was laundry. I asked every day, and I waited patiently. Eventually, there was an opening, and it was finally my time. I was so excited to finally try one of those sandwiches. My first night of work came soon enough. I walked into a large room set up like a laundromat with 4 commercial washers and 4 commercial dryers. In front of the washers was a huge pile of clothes. As the first round gets washed and dried, there's a lull, and that's when we can sit and watch TV. But after that, it's on and cracking. I never counted how many shirts or pants I folded each round, but the piles were roughly 9 feet long, 3 feet high each time we emptied the dryers. The work was extremely repetitive. Fold in half, fold the arms in, fold in half again, stack. Fold in half, fold the arms in, fold again, stack, over and over again. I worked every night, 7 days a week, from 9 p.m. until 5 a.m., washing, drying, and folding. My job was constant and never let up from the day I started until the day I was released from custody. My employer, the Humboldt County Correctional Facility. My pay, 5 small cups of coffee, no cream, no sugar, 5 cups of Kool-Aid, usually watered down, and a sandwich at midnight. Oh yeah, back to the sandwich. The sandwich was just terrible. It was a real grass is greener feeling as I took my first bite and felt in my mouth how soggy the bread was, like eating a wet, doughy blob. I can describe the experience as eating a gas station sandwich that was made days or weeks before I bought it, and like chewing on an old, soggy sponge. But don't get me wrong, I'm glad I did the work, and I wouldn't change it for anything because it taught me to do a task until it was completed. And that no matter how big my personal laundry pile is, it will never compare to the piles of laundry I washed, folded, and put away in that time of my life. The end. The next component of the project, which serves as an important transition point, where the participants begin the transition from student to teacher by creating a instructional video that demonstrates their skill. And here is Michelle M. Miller's instructional video.
Hello? Yeah, I was just headed out the door. I've got some of everything. I've got light meat, dark meat, ham, stuffing, potatoes, the whole works, enough for 4 people. You're home now? Okay, I'll be right there. I'm just around the corner. It'll only take me a minute. Okay, thanks. All right, bye-bye. Where's she going now? To drop off some food for a man and his kids. Wow, a whole Christmas dinner to go? Yep. Later, she's taking a tent and some blankets to a couple that she met yesterday. She's always doing nice stuff for others. Why? What does she get out of it? Does she make money? No, she gets happiness. Happiness? She was always happy. She wasn't always. She used to get really depressed sometimes, and she would go to bed and sleep for days. Really? What fixed her? Giving. Giving what? Anything and everything. I saw her give a truck away once to a man and his son that were always walking to and from work and carrying all their tools and carrying their groceries long distances in the rain. She got a new vehicle and she gave them her truck. Wow. And that's what fixed her? Fixed her depression? Yep. When you do nice things for others, it sets off all kinds of great things in the brain. It releases serotonin and melatonin and oxytocin and endorphins. It gives you that all over good feeling. Wow. I'm going to do that. Thank you. Thank you.
So once they've identified, named, and visualized their skill, they then create an exercise for others to learn it. And then each participant is responsible for testing their own curriculum by completing it themselves. And the framework for lesson plan development was created by me and consists of 3 assignments that each participant is responsible for making. Here is Tim Juranovich's Being Alone testimonial exercise, which has 3 parts. Part 1, over the course of a few days, keep track of moments in your day when you are alone and are just taking care of you. Part 2, pick 4 moments you wrote down Make a drawing for each one and write a short description. Part 3, for each moment, write a testimonial illustrating how it benefits you in some way to inspire other people to enjoy the same moments in their day. And here is Tim's response. He writes on 4/1/21, did laundry. Cleaning, drying, folding, and putting away laundry is a very fulfilling experience versus wearing dirty, waxy, and oily clothes, like an armor against society. So once this work is all complete, all participants are given the opportunity to be paid instructors in a public context. And for each presentation, one person is asked to be the lead instructor and develop an interactive performance to invite a larger audience into the work. We've given 3 group presentations since the project began, twice at PSU's Art and Social Practice Assembly, and another at the Center for Photographic Art. Now, for example, our most recent presentations in 2021, Michelle M. Miller was our lead instructor, and she completed a walking performance of her skill, Random Acts of Kindness. Essentially, what we did is we picked a 4-block route in Eureka as a group and choreographed random acts of care in the neighborhood, such as painting a fence, sweeping leaves, and bleaching the wall of a public building. And this next story, which is titled The Backyard, further illustrates how happenstance can bring this work into the larger recovery community. A day before our second presentation at PSU's assembly, a man named Michael comes into the backyard of the house where we are practicing. He is the neighborhood landscaper. As he's bagging leaves, he stops and looks up and asks what we're doing. I tell him all the details, and he responds, "Man, this is giving me goosebumps." He tells me this story about his own past with substance abuse and how he had just buried his son to an overdose days before. And then he decides to sit in as a guest during our rehearsals and actually helps during our performance. And after we finish, Michael gives out hugs freely and speaks holding his chest about what it meant for him to be part of this work. Fortunately, with some funding secured by the California Arts Council, the next phase of the project will begin shortly, where graduating participants will be paid as teachers to work with their own cohort of students. So essentially, they are taking on my role as the main instructor, where each teacher would be responsible for taking their students through the framework established in the first phase of the project. And what this work does is it claims forms of knowledge authority by giving individuals access to the mediums that only the select few are granted, such as the field guides, which define the parameters of our lived environments, the lecture hall where only the most educated can stand in front, and the viral YouTube videos that define the value of one voice over another. And these are all systems that we use to separate the value of person and place. I see this work also as an intervention into what has been coined by Paulo Freire as the banking educational system, which sees students as empty vessels where teachers are responsible for filling their mind with knowledge that is outside of the self. And what this does is it suppresses experiential knowledge, the kind that is inherent to living. So I'm interested in reframing the body as a source of knowledge and holding the inherent value of the self as important as institutional knowledge. And the irony of my critique is not lost on me, as I'm getting a degree from an institution, thus qualifying myself as an expert. I critique the institution of expertise. I recognize the value of book learning, but I think it's important in this context to prioritize the knowledge that comes from lived experience and the lived experience that comes from crisis. And in conclusion, this brings me back to the concept of mentorship. Mentorship is a form of radical trust. It's an investment in human capacity because it requires belief, vulnerability, and acceptance, among many things required to build solidarity within society. It also counters how whiteness uses capitalism to divorce knowledge and skill from its rightful place in culture and tradition, because mentorship is all about sharing from one generation to the next, one person to the other, where we get to see where knowledge comes from and how it's being used by other people. I have felt the care of mentoring, known the responsibility of mentorship, but now I understand the importance of helping people find a path to their own practice of mentorship. And through these acts of reciprocity, I've learned that through engagement that serves the mutual interests of all people involved, that I can move beyond the traditional forms of image making that often hide under the guise of saviorism. And through mentorship, we can create a cycle of giving and receiving, where every person in this balanced shape of collaboration learns how to be more human in relationship to others. So thank you so much again for being here. And yeah, that's the end of my grad talk. And I think we have a few minutes for some questions if people have any. I got a peanut gallery in the room.
If there are any questions in the room, if you could come down here so Justin can see you, that would be great.
Fantastic. So Marina's up next, right?
Okay, well, since there are no questions, I want to thank everybody for joining us for Justin's grad lecture. And if you're interested in learning more about Justin's work, please check out the program's online SOFA journal, where Justin has done collaborative interviews with all the co-authors in his Chester's book project. And our next event, which is also online, is where Marina Lopez and Clara Takarabe will be inviting you to rest.
Justin does not get off with no question.
You like how I kind of like massage that, right?
I don't even know what my question is going to be. Okay, so Justin, one of the things that I am noticing about the way that you talk about your work is you move between this like very practical doing things in an experiential way with people and like bringing things out to talking about capitalism and white supremacy. And I guess I just want to hear why it's important for you to describe the work that you're doing within those like giant idea frames, rather than speaking about it more in terms of like healing on a personal level. Thank you.
That's a good question. Save that one from our oral review. I think partly, and just speaking about like thinking about addiction in relationship to capitalism. I just think that like talking about the conditions that create the, the sort of like speaking about the social conditions that create these sort of moments where people feel sort of disemboweled from their own life experience, like, and where substance abuse kind of seeps in to the cracks of personal history. I think that like addressing it from those larger perspectives, I think is important. And like I mentioned in my talk, I think when the media just highlights a person's own individual accountability, I think it sort of removes like this larger conversation around what's causing, like, what are the systems that we live in that cause people to sort of to rely on using, right? So I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I mean, I think, yeah.
That was great, thanks. That was helpful for my brain. More questions, come on, y'all. And I know you've been here a lot, but don't have off the hook so easy. Any chat questions?
Justin, so I know that you wanted to turn Field Guides soon to a school. Can you tell us more about that? And what are your like future steps around the Field Guide project and possibly are you interested in doing Field Guides in other spaces and other settings?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a one that I can knock out. Yeah, so we recently got some funding, like I mentioned, to pay graduating students as teachers, right? And I think that to me is like the groundwork for creating this idea of a school. And the school essentially would live in Eureka, and like they would be basically graduating participants would basically carry the mentorship process forward, and I would be there to kind of help the larger framework for keeping things on sort of on task and organized and etc. But the participants would be responsible for their own curriculum development and recruiting their own participants. And yeah, and I think to me that's something that I'm really excited about, because I'm only one person, and the project was just like a huge load for me, because I mean, like, I have an individual relationship with all of the people in the project. Like, we have phone conversations regularly, like we meet regularly, like I've developed like really close relationships with them. So I think to me, it just makes sense to like have, the people who graduate build their own relationships with new students. And yeah, like I'm really interested in taking this work to other contexts and other places. And I'm hoping to get an artist in resident, potentially in Portland with the recovery community there. And I have a good friend who is the director of a MAT program, medical assisted treatment program in Hoopa, which I mentioned where I grew up. And we're going to be working together with some of her clients using some of the iterations of the Field Guide project over the summer. So, which I'm pretty excited about that. So.
Justin, I have a question now. So I'm curious, hi. So if you're establishing this kind of like school kind of program where people who are graduating from your program will then become the teachers, what will be your role in that whole process?
Yeah, I mean, like, for example, with the current student that is going to be the teacher, his name's Aaron Ochoa, and I've worked with him numerous times. We've sat down, we've talked through different steps of his curriculum that he wants to take. I'm just like guiding him through the process, and kind of like, he's never taught a class before, right? So like, what are the days, of your class, your schedule, like what happens every day, like how is it building on itself, like what's the end result? And how is it different than what we did during our time together? So I think that like, I definitely will still mentor each of the teachers in their role as teachers. Yeah, so I think that's the next step. And I can't think beyond that. I can't see in terms of if it turns into a school and there's like staff and et cetera, et cetera. I don't necessarily know what my role in that context will be, but I'm imagining it will reveal itself with time. So.
Thank you. I want to ask one more question.
Oh,
This is a question I've been thinking about and not put into words for a really long time, which is just like, oh, it's so weird to be up. I'm looking at, anyways, I can't see you. Thanks. Like for instance, with the all of the instructions, there's a quality to them that is surprising and like good, weird poetry, like the being alone instructions. Like the list of actual instructions are so strange. And I wonder how you supported people or how the people had the aesthetic and conceptual and, just like practical taste to choose those weird statements. So the question is, was there a way that you supported people to select those kinds of instructions that have a quality that's like poetry?
that's a good question. I mean, I think that like what you're seeing is like a really refined version of the sort of the journey, right? So when we're making these individual steps or prompts or whatever exercises, a lot of times we're just like meeting in person, we're talking through, and then we create like a paragraph of text together, through the things that we say. I'll record a conversation and then transcribe it later. And then we meet up later with the transcription, and then we just kind of distill the words down to just the kind of the most simple versions. And I think when you can talk, I think I encourage sort of the sort of poetic sort of just, exploration, right? And sometimes words can emerge just through a conversation. They wouldn't necessarily happen if you're concentrated on writing something specific. So yeah, so we translate the audio and then pick words that I think are interesting. So if that makes sense.
It sort of makes sense, and it definitely works.
I think we're at the 3-minute part.
Woo, good job.
Thank you, everyone.
Now I'll repeat what I said earlier. So thank you again for joining us. Again,